On a freezing Vermont morning, a woman from Boston, dressed for a boardroom, not a barn, found herself stranded on a quiet country road. What she didn't expect was that a local farmer, with calloused hands and a quiet smile, would not only fix her car, but change her entire understanding of art, purpose, and love. She came looking for a business deal. What she found was something far more rare. Mitchell was checking on his livestock when he heard the sound of a car engine sputtering to a stop on the country road that bordered his property. The winter morning was crisp and clear across the rolling hills of Vermont, where Farmer Thomas at 36, Thomas had learned that unexpected visitors usually meant either lost tourists or neighbors in need of help. And either way, his grandfather's teachings about hospitality meant he should offer assistance. What he discovered when he walked toward the road would challenge. A sleek silver sedan sat at an awkward angle on the shoulder, steam rising from under its hood, while a woman in an elegant beige coat stood beside it. Everything he thought he knew about first impressions and the assumptions people make about each other. Clearly frustrated by her circumstances, she appeared to be in her early 30s with blonde hair styled in a sophisticated updo, wearing what looked like expensive business attire that seemed completely out of place on a rural Vermont road. "Excuse me," Thomas called out as he woman turned toward him with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I hope so. I'm not exactly sure what happened." Approached, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "Looks like you're having some car trouble. Can I help?" The engine just started making terrible noises. And now it won't start at all. Thomas noticed her refined accent. And the way she held herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having problems solved quickly and efficiently. "I'm Thomas Mitchell, Victoria Ashford," she replied, shaking his hand with a firmness that surprised him. "And I'm completely out of my element here," said, extending a hand that was honest with calluses from years of farm work. "I live just up the hill there. I was driving from Boston to a business meeting in Burlington when this happened." Thomas lifted the hood of her car and immediately identified the problem. "Looks like your radiator hose has split. That's what caused the overheating. The good news is it's. How long will that take?" "I have a very important meeting this afternoon." "Well, the nearest auto parts store is about 20 miles away. Fixable, but you'll need a replacement part and some coolant." Victoria's expression grew concerned. "And with this being Saturday morning, they might not even have the right part in stock." Thomas paused, considering options. "But I might have something in my barn that could work as a temporary fix. At least enough to get you to town." Victoria looked toward his farm with obvious hesitation. "Clearly. Why don't you come up to the barn and we'll see what we can do?" As they walked up the gravel drive toward Thomas's property, Victoria found herself taking in details she hadn't expected. Weighing her options. "That's very kind of you to offer, but I don't want to impose." "No imposition at all," Thomas replied with the easy generosity that came naturally to him. "Besides, it's too cold to stand out here while we figure this out." The farm was modest but impeccably maintained with neat fences. "How long have you lived here?" Victoria asked, making conversation as they approached a large red barn. Well-art for buildings, and an overall sense of pride and ownership that spoke to someone who took their responsibilities seriously. That looked like something from a postcard. "My whole life," Thomas replied. "This farm has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built their barn with his own hands back in 1924. When Thomas opened the barn doors the barn had been partially converted into what was clearly a workshop. But not just any workshop. Gestured for Victoria to step inside, what she saw took her breath away in a way that had nothing to do with the December cold. Along the walls hung dozens of beautifully crafted wooden pieces. Hand-carved furniture that showed extraordinary skill and artistic vision. Rocking chairs with intricate details. Dining tables with grain patterns that seemed to flow like water. Children's toys carved with whimsical precision. "It's just a hobby, something I do in the evenings when the farm work is done." Victoria moved through the workshop with the careful attention of someone who understood craftsmanship and quality. "Thomas," Victoria said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Did you make all of these? Thomas seemed embarrassed by her attention to his work. She ran her fingers along the smooth surface of a rocking chair, noting the perfect joints and the way the wood seemed to glow with careful finishing. Thomas looked confused by her question. I don't sell them. I make them for neighbors, friends, people who need furniture but can't afford the expensive store-bought stuff. This isn't just a hobby, she said, her professional training taking over. This is museum-quality work. Where do you sell these pieces? Victoria stared at him, processing what he just said. Here was someone creating artwork and giving it away because people needed it. Thomas, do you have any idea what pieces like? Victoria continued exploring his workshop, discovering pieces that would fit perfectly in the most expensive galleries she knew. This would sell for in Boston or New York. I've never really thought about it, Thomas replied honestly, moving toward his collection of car parts to look for something that might fix Victoria's radiator problem. But more than the quality of the work, she was moved by the obvious love and care that went into every piece. The way each item was created, not for profit, but for the joy. I own Ashford Galleries in Boston, and I specialize in American craft work. Thomas looked up from the radiator hose he'd found, his expression shifting as he began to understand what Victoria was telling him. You're an art dealer. Of making something beautiful and useful. Thomas, Victoria said quietly. What I do for a living is find and represent artisans whose work deserves a wider audience. I'm someone who believes that exceptional talent should be recognized and rewarded. Victoria replied her. For the next hour, while Thomas repaired Victoria's car with the same careful attention he brought to his woodworking, they talked about art, craftsmanship, and the difference between creating for love versus creating for money. Excitement growing as she imagined the possibilities. Thomas, your work is extraordinary. People would pay thousands of dollars for pieces like this. Victoria learned that Thomas had taught himself woodworking using his grandfather's tools and books from the library. Thomas learned that Victoria had grown up appreciating fine craftsmanship, had studied art history in college, and had built her gallery specifically to promote American artisans whose work embodied traditional skills and contemporary vision, developing techniques through experimentation and practice. He never considered his work valuable beyond its usefulness to his community. The meeting I was driving to, Victoria explained as Thomas finished the repair, is with a collector who's looking for exactly this kind of. Not to change what you do or how you do it, but to make sure people who would treasure these pieces can find them. Work. Handcrafted pieces with authentic American stories behind them. When Thomas had successfully fixed her car, and it was running smoothly again, Victoria made him an offer that would change both their lives. I'd like to represent your work, she said simply. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering implications he never thought about before. What would that mean for the neighbors who need? 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell's work was featured in a one-man show at Ashford Galleries, with every piece selling to collectors who appreciated both the artistry and the story of the Vermont farmer who created beauty with his hands and shared it with. Furniture? Victoria smiled, understanding immediately why his work was so special. It would mean you could afford to make even more pieces for neighbors who need them because collectors in Boston would be happy to pay for the privilege of owning Thomas Mitchell originals. Built on mutual respect for each other's talents and shared appreciation for the value of creating something meaningful, Victoria began spending weekends at the farm. His community. But more meaningful to both Thomas and Victoria was the relationship that had developed between them. Be learning about Thomas's process and helping him manage the business side of his newfound success. Thomas discovered that beneath Victoria's polished exterior was someone who valued authenticity, craftsmanship. A year later, when they were married in the same barn where Victoria had first seen Thomas's work, the ceremony was surrounded by pieces he had created specifically for their wedding, including the rocking chairs where they would sit together in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Vermont hills. And the simple pleasure of making something beautiful with your hands. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in galleries or showrooms, but in barns on cold winter mornings. When we take the time to Really see what someone has created with love, skill, and generous spirit. And sometimes falling in love isn't about appearances or circumstances, but about recognizing in another person the same values and passions that make life meaningful. Victoria kept the first piece Thomas ever made specifically for her. Not because it was valuable, but because it represented the moment when two different worlds discovered they shared the same appreciation for beauty. A simple wooden box with their initials carved into the lid. Craftsmanship, and the joy of creating something together.